Hi everyone, welcome back if you're a regular viewer. If you're not, then please remember to hit that subscribe button. In this week's video, we're going to be looking at pivot tables. Now you're probably used to having to manually refresh these pivot tables, but what if I told you there's various methods to automatically refresh them? So in this video, we're going to be looking at three different methods. The first method is going to be the new feature, which is currently available on the Excel Insiders channel, which natively allows you to turn on auto pivot refresh. The second method, we're going to look at a more formula-driven approach, which uses the dynamic spill arrays and specifically the function PIVOTBY. And then finally, if you stick around long enough, we'll be looking at a more old school approach, which will be more widely available to all Excel users, where we tackle the problem using Visual Basic macros. Let's dive right into it. If you're new to pivot tables, then why don't you check out this video that I've added as a card, which gives a full introduction on how to use pivot tables. For the purposes of this example, we're going to work with a small data set, which I've set up here. The theme of this is around English Premier League results. This is a nice little sample data set. We can do multiple different views. We could look at how teams are performing in terms of goals scored, goals conceded, points, home versus away performance, date performance. So this should give us some different views we can do with a pivot table. So our first technique that we're going to look at using this sample data set is a new feature that's available within Excel 365, currently only on the Beta Insiders channel. So to illustrate this technique, we're going to start building a pivot table off the back of this data set. Just note this data set is within a table that I've called T-data. This is good practice when you're using your pivot tables, so as and when this table expands, our pivot table will automatically recognize the new range of data. So I'm just going to click down here. We're going to go up to Insert and Pivot Table, and we're going to go from a table or range. And then we're just going to point to this table, and we're just going to click anywhere in there and press Control A. You can see that's now recognized our table name that we just saw, T-data. And then I'm going to click OK on this. Our pivot table is going to appear down here under the data. So one particular view we could do for this is we could put the teams in the rows, and we could have a look at how many goals they've scored and how many goals they've conceded in total. Just expanded out that column so we can see the team names a bit better. And then I'm just going to tweak the design of this pivot so that it's matching in with the green theme of the table, and maybe add some column banding. Just make this column a little bit bigger too so we can see the full title. As and when data changes with a pivot table, you're probably used to right clicking and going to refresh, or going up to the data ribbon and clicking refresh all. The problem with this is when we add new data, so we could put a test team into the data set, and then if we right click, refresh, then we see that data come through. But we've had to do that manual right click and refresh. It's not a particularly big job, but it's potential for errors with people forgetting to refresh the pivot tables. So what we can do, I'm just going to undo that. And instead, with Excel 365 on the Insider channel, this will be available for full release no doubt soon. We're just going to go up to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. Make sure you clicked on your pivot table for this to appear. Note if we're clicked outside of the area, it's not available. And then you'll see this new button called Auto Refresh. Now if we click that, you'll see that's now highlighted and active. And another way we could do this is just right clicking on the pivot table, going into the pivot table options, and then going up to the data tab, and you can see there's this tick box for automatically refresh when the source data changes. So now that we've got that option enabled for auto refresh, let's test it out in action. So I'm just going to add that test team row again into my table, and as soon as we press enter on that, you can see test team has appeared down in the pivot. And we can test out whether we're getting data by putting in some goals scored and some goals conceded. You can see that's perfect. That's come through nicely. No more click and refresh. No more worrying about whether your pivot is up to date. So method number 2, we're going to use dynamic spill arrays. and specifically the PIVOTBY or GROUPBY functions. So using exactly the same data set again, we're going to use equals PIVOTBY. As soon as we start typing pivot, we can see PIVOTBY. We're just going to press tab to commit that function. And then this is going to ask for a series of arguments. So for our row fields argument, we entered the team names in our previous example. We're going to do exactly the same thing. Instead of dragging into a pivot field, we're just going to click on the column header, and the shortcut to highlight all the rows within a column when you're working with tables is Control and space. So now we've got our teams and the header selected as our row fields. We're into the column fields argument. For this pivot, I'm not going to split the columns in any particular way. If you cast your mind back to the previous pivot, we didn't use any column fields on there either. So we can simply press comma again to step through to our values argument. Now our values in our previous pivot, we used the goals scored and the goals conceded. So I'm just going to highlight those two column headers, and then I'm going to use the Control and spacebar shortcut to highlight the whole column. The next argument within PIVOTBY is a function. We're just going to use the eta lambda sum, and then we're going to press comma. Now we're into our optional arguments within PIVOTBY, denoted by these square brackets. I'm just going to leave those all as blank for now. Let's have a look at how this is generating. Okay, so we've got the same basic data where we had teams, goals scored and goals conceded. However, we're missing the column headers that we had in here, and we're also missing some formatting. So let's look at how we can do those two things. So if we click in the first cell of our dynamic spill array so that we can edit this formula, and if we look at these optional arguments that we just skipped over, so for field headers, we've got the option to show these by pressing number 3. So I'm just going to either press directly on the keyboard 3 or press the down arrow down to 3 and then press tab. Therefore we've got headers. Let's just close our parenthesis and see how that's looking. Okay, we've got our headers now for our columns. And now the next step is how we can get some nice formatting on this. So we're going to select in the first cell of our array, and we're going to go up to the home ribbon and then conditional formatting, and we're going to go to new rule. We're going to use a formula for this. So we're going to go equals, we're going to click on the first cell within our array. I'm just going to press the F4 button 3 times so that we get rid of any locked or anchors using the dollars. We're going to put the back arrow and the forward arrow, so not equals to this denotes, and then we're going to put double quotes, double quotes. So we're basically saying where that cell is not blank. And then what do we want to do when that cell isn't blank? We want to go to the format. We're just going to put an outline on there for now, and then we're going to click OK. Now if we click OK on that, you see that's just applied to the first cell within our array. So now we're going to go back into manage rules within conditional formatting, and we're going to work with this applies to field. So that's telling us where we want to apply that rule to. So unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, but let me know in the comments if you know any other ways around this, you can't refer to this dynamic range by either using the trim range function or the hash identifier. So for example, this should recognize that dynamic spill array and then apply it appropriately. But if we click OK or apply on that, you'll notice it works. It's correctly identified that spill array, but it's converted it to its static range. So if that range changes, then this conditional formatting won't apply. We can test that out by clicking OK. We're just going to go add a test row in here. And you can see that that test row has correctly worked into our dynamic spill array. However, the conditional formatting has not applied because that row 24, if we go back into conditional formatting, manage rules, this worksheet, you can see our formatting got cut off at 23. So unfortunately, because the hashtag for dynamic spill array or the trim range functions don't appear to work in here at the moment, we're just going to do a quick workaround for that. And we're going to apply that to a bigger range than we need. However, it knows for each cell within that range, it's going to check whether the contents are not blank, and it'll only apply that border if that rule is true. So we're not going to get excessive formatting here. However, it's not the most efficient way of writing because Excel is trying to evaluate a bigger range than what we actually need. So if we click OK, we've now correctly got the grid lines. We could go further with this. For example, we could either have the headers in bold that won't change position, so we could do that manually. And we could also maybe say a new rule, and then we can click on that cell again, press our F4 button 3 times to get rid of the dollars, and we could say equals total. So that's going to look for where any cell within our array has the words total, and we could say we always wanted that to be in bold, and we might also say we want to give it a slight grey fill along with the border. So if we click OK on that and click OK, we'll just copy this exact same applies to range that we used for the grid lines originally, and we'll click apply. Now you can see we've got the total in grey, however it's just literally applying to that cell. So what we could do is if we go to manage rules, where we put A16, we could add a column lock on that. So if we go to edit rule, and if we press F4 once, 2 times, 3 times, we've now got the $sign on the A, which means it's going to iterate through every row, but it's only going to be checking if column A has total within it. So what we should get now is we should get on row 24, it recognizes total is within column A, but it's also going to apply it to those 3 other columns we've got. So we click OK and apply. There we go. We've got that applied across. So you can see that these dynamic spill arrays are nice, automatically update as we add new data. We could put 5 goals in there, 1 goal in there. That's pulling through nicely to our array. So that's automatic, and we've made it look a little bit cleaner by adding that conditional formatting, which is going to shift around dynamically now for our array. Okay, so let's have a look at another option. Now this option is useful, particularly where you've not got the latest Excel 365, where you won't have that auto refresh option, and you also potentially won't have the dynamic spill arrays, so you won't have the equals pivot by feature we've looked at. So for this option, we're going to use Visual Basics, and we're going to have a macro that triggers every time a cell is changed within our data source. So to set this up, we'll do the same as in our first example. We'll go to Insert Pivot Table, from Table and Range, click into our table, press Ctrl and A. This one's called TData3. Click OK, and then we're going to drop our teams into our rows, and we'll use our goals scored and goals conceded again as our values. So now we need to set up the code to enable this to auto refresh. So we're going to go into Visual Basics. If you've not been in here before, you might want to check out my other video where I do an introduction to Visual Basics. I'll link this in the cards above. Now we're going to need to go into Visual Basics, which lives on the Developer tab. If you don't have this, you can right click anywhere on your ribbon. You can customize the ribbon, and then you can make sure that in your main tabs on the right hand side, your Developer tab has a tick by it. That will make it appear. So now we've got the Developer tab, we need to go into Visual Basics. You can go via this icon here, or you can just use the keyboard shortcut Alt and F11. This will open up the Visual Basics editor. When you first open this up, we'll need to navigate to the object, or sheet in this case, that contains the data. So the data that's going to feed your pivot table. Our data is on this worksheet, sheet 3, and therefore I've started building the code within this sheet. Now what this code will do is we'll just close this window, and I'll step through line by line and explain how it's working after, but we'll just close that window. And now that we've got that code active on this sheet, I'll just show that this pivot table has the auto refresh option disabled. We're going to go and add a test row in, and then you can see that's added into our pivot table, and we can add in some goals for and against. So that's all updating automatically as soon as we type using Visual Basics. Now let's dig into how that's actually working so you can understand and help you to build your own code. We're going to press Alt and F11 again to go back into Visual Basics Editor. So we talked about how we added the code onto the relevant sheet with the data in. That's step number 1. And then we've started setting up a private subroutine on this worksheet that says every time there's a change with a value within the range, execute the following code. So this opening line here is important because that's how the Visual Basics knows when to execute every time a cell changes in that data table. Next up, we've declared a variable. So we've said dim LO, so we're just abbreviating list objects as LO to save us typing out list objects repetitively in the code. So every time we refer to LO, it's going to know we mean list objects. Then we've moved on to say what does LO equal. So we need to declare an object tied to that variable. This is just like an let statement in Excel, which you might be more familiar with if you've not used Visual Basics before. So we're saying LO is equal to me.listObjects t_data3. Now, t_data3 you're probably familiar with back into Excel. If we go to table design, that's the name of our table containing our data. So we've said list objects because that's how Visual Basics refers to an Excel table, as a list object. And where we use me.listObjects, me is a way of referring to this specific sheet that we've written the code in. You might be used to declaring specific sheets when you're working with Visual Basics, particularly if you're writing code within modules. However, when you're writing code on a specific sheet, using that shortcut me, that tells it that you're actually referring to the sheet the code's in. So instead of writing worksheet and then referring to sheet 3 or the actual name of the sheet, pivot table, auto VBA. Okay, so we've defined the list object. Now we're going to step on to the next section where we've got this if statement. Basically what this is doing is checking, has a cell changed within the data body range of the table? And if it hasn't changed, it does nothing. And if it has changed, it carries on with the code. So when something does change, we've then declared PT as pivot table. So we're just declaring a variable, much like we did with LO as list object. We're just shortening that pivot table reference or the object reference. Then we're saying for each time, so where you see for each in VBA, that's a loop. It's going to execute this code repetitively for each instance. So we're saying for each PT, i.e. every pivot table in me.PivotTables, so in this sheet, it's looking for every pivot table. So this code will work for more than one pivot table, not just one. This example, we only have one. And then it's going to say execute pt.refreshTable. So that's the code to refresh every pivot table it finds. And then you see this next PT is saying go through to the next pivot table object that it's found on that sheet. Once it's got to the end and it's looped through all the pivot tables it can find on that sheet, then it exits the if by end if, and then it ends the subroutine. So you can see here how we've picked up list objects, checked for cell changes within that list object or our table, and then we've said every time a cell changes within that table, go through and look at all the pivot tables and refresh them. And that short bit of code there basically replicates the new Excel 365 insider feature of pivot table auto refresh. However, this is available in much older versions of Excel. So to recap, we've looked at 3 methods for automatic pivot refresh. The new Excel 365 beta option, which is arguably the easiest method. Dynamic array formulas such as PivotBy for flexible calculation-driven options. And a Visual Basics macro that triggers whenever the source data changes. My recommendation, if you've got the new feature, then turn it on. A nice easy option. If you don't have this available yet, then you could use the PivotBy feature. Or if you're looking for a widely available option, try that Visual Basics. And that's it. Please remember to hit the subscribe button. Let me know if it's been useful by giving it a thumbs up. And I'll see you again next week for some more helpful tips and tricks. Thanks for watching.